Hi friends and welcome back to my channel. Today we are taking a look at every single tarot deck that is currently in my collection. I recently did an Oracle deck collection video, which I will link in the cards in the description box below if you missed that. But this is all about every single tarot deck I currently have on my shelf. It's going to be a long one, so let's get stuck straight in. First up we have the incredible Next World Tarot by Christy C. Rode. This deck is one of my all-time favorites. I do have the independent version that was kickstarted originally. It does now come mass market, I suppose. It was picked up by a publisher, which is great, making it a lot more accessible. Still not the cheapest deck in the world. We sell it for $90 at my bookshop. I think there is also now a mini version, which is great because these cards are massive. But I do really like that about these cards because the imagery is quite detailed, and even just all like the different elements here. I think I really enjoy that the cards are quite big because I think it sort of gives the artwork space to breathe and you can really appreciate all the different elements within the cards rather than it just sort of looking quite busy, which I think maybe this artwork could do. I don't know, I haven't seen the smaller deck myself. Anyway, what I love about this deck is just how it represents so many different bodies and so many different experiences in ways that feel very celebratory and genuine. And I just feel like more than probably any other deck that I own, I see the world as I experience it in this deck. And that's what I love about it so much. It is absolutely inherently a political deck. It's very much lent into that, which is something that I very much appreciate personally. It's also just really beautiful. It's sort of like this dystopian world that's been created in these cards, but it feels so alive, beautiful, and celebratory is a word that I feel like really applies to this deck, at least for me. Next is a deck that I'm sort of like known for loving on TarotTube. This is the Gill Tarot by Elizabeth Josephine Gill. This is the old edition that was printed in 1990. It has since been republished by US Games in the last couple of years. The box is a little different, but the artwork's pretty much exactly the same. Maybe with some minor saturation changes, but nothing significant, I don't think. This is a really interesting deck. It's not so much Rider-Waite-Smith based. It's more based on the Golden Dawn principles in general. And it is somewhat pippish. It's not like scenic minor arcana at all. They're interesting. And a few years ago back on Eclectic Tarot, I remember people describing this as one of the ugliest decks they'd ever seen. And I just fell in love with it. I just didn't understand that criticism at all. Although I can appreciate that it's quite a unique deck. I haven't seen a lot of decks that are like this, especially as far as the minor arcana are concerned. Sometimes we do get somewhat of a scene, like this is the Two of Wands, for example, and all of the minor arcana also have a title. Whereas others are even less scenic. This is the Seven of Coins. So there's not kind of the imagery that you might be used to if you're used to more Rider-Waite-Smith based decks. The court cards also have a title. For example, the Princess of Cups is Evolution. And I just love it. This is one of my favorite decks. And as I said, I'm sort of known on TarotTube for this being a deck that I love because I've spoken about it a lot over the years. I do have a full review of this deck. I have a few other videos that I've, have just spoken about this deck, and even a video talking about my response to it being republished and everything. So if you've been on this channel for more than 5 minutes, you've heard me talk about this deck. You've seen this deck before. Next, we have a deck that's a little bit newer to me, but I have done a flip through. I think I did an unboxing of this deck when I first got it. And it is the Star Spinner Tarot by Trungles. The boy diviner, Casper, totally sold me on this deck. He's the reason I bought it. And thank you, Casper, because it's beautiful. I adore the colours in this deck. But I definitely recommend checking out Casper's channel because he talks a little bit more about the imagery in this deck. It's not a deck I've spent a huge amount of time with. I have done a few readings and I've enjoyed all of them, but I don't feel like I am at all an expert on some of the choices that are made in terms of the imagery and what's included in the cards. I was very much coming at it from just like someone who knows tarot, knows the system of tarot, and appreciating the cards as they appear to me. Casper and some other people have sort of gone into some more of like what's actually included in the cards in terms of symbolism and mythology, for example. But it's a beautiful deck, and even just the production of it I think is lovely. It's really well done, and yeah, I will never shut up about these colors. They're so pretty, and like just seeing the cards all laid out together, it's just really, really beautiful, and some really, really interesting imagery in this deck that I haven't seen before. Next up, we have my garden deck, which is a deck that I was very much anticipating. I found this creator on Instagram, I don't know, a couple of years ago now, I suppose, when they were just in the process of creating the deck. And then this was a deck that I backed on Kickstarter or Indiegogo or something like that a little while ago. And I just fell in love with the art style and the sort of color palette that the artist was going for. I just thought it was really lovely. It's quite a small deck. It's much smaller than normal, which is why we're zoomed in. But that makes it very, very easy to handle. It is also a square deck. I will say the printing isn't super high quality. I think especially with this black backing, it sort of has bled onto the front of the cards slightly. But it also was a much more affordable deck than a lot of decks that go on Kickstarter and whatnot. So I won't hold that against it. But I do know that I think that bothered some people. I don't find it that annoying. I just really like the artwork, and I think it's a really sort of like simplistic pared back, but still quite interesting take on the cards that we know so well. And I'm glad it's finally out in the world, even though I haven't really seen a lot of people talking about it online or sharing it since it's been released, which makes me a little bit sad. So maybe this is a deck I need to talk about more because I think it's lovely. Next up is the Tarot de St Croix by Litha de St Croix. This is a deck I've sort of hinted at already that I am doing a full video on, and I'm hoping that that will be the next video you see after this one. So if you're interested in that, definitely keep an eye out for that video. This is a really, really beautiful deck, a really interesting deck, and a very personal deck, I would say. The Little White Book is a very little white book, but I do really appreciate how Litha has sort of explained her choices in terms of the imagery in the cards. And a lot of the times those, like the choices and the reasoning for what's depicted is very personal. And I really like that, and I really appreciate that. The colours in this deck are very, very rich, and the orange is something that not everybody likes. I didn't at first either, although I have grown to not really notice it so much anymore. And I think from memory, it's sort of supposed to be representative of the terracotta that maybe these images were painted on, or had something to do with the creation of the deck anyway. And so I'm not opposed to the orange anymore. I do love the imagery. I think it's really rich and vibrant and beautiful. And I like how there's like a mix of contemporary and more historical imagery. I just think it's a really interesting deck, and it's been executed very well. Next up, we have the Fountain Tarot, which is one of my old favorites and was a really big deck in the tarot sphere for a few years. I know people still love it and use it, but yeah, I feel like this is one of those decks that really made an impact. And in part, I think that's just the general production and the sort of like advertising around the deck was really successful and really clever. Additionally, though, like this deck is just a work of art. The way that light and movement is depicted in this deck, I think, is just unparalleled in anything else I've really seen. And it offers a really sort of fresh take on very traditional imagery. And I think people really responded to that when this deck was released, and I know I was certainly among them. Additionally, the people in this deck are painted like based off models, so they feel really real because they are. I think this deck was sort of produced when the conversation around diversity was sort of starting to gain traction in the tarot world. So there's sort of like elements of diversity here, but I wouldn't say it would really pass the diversity test these days. So yeah, just keep that in mind, I suppose, if this is a deck that interests you. The art is absolutely stunning. I really, really love the color palette. And I think the way that our traditional meanings have been represented, like the Emperor, this is such a clever representation of the Emperor. It's so simple, but it brings across so much in such an effective way. I just think it's really, really cleverly done. And I think this is a great beginner deck if this sort of appeals to you, just for that reason alone, that it's simple, it's still the traditional meanings, but just done in a way that, I don't know, I feel like you can just get this imagery really easily. It's sort of been like stripped back to the core, and they've really thought about how to represent these cards in a way that's impactful, is clear, but fresh and updated. Now for a deck I got fairly recently, at the end of last year, I think, so I haven't actually worked with it at all, and forgive me because I don't really know how to pronounce this, but I've heard it pronounced as the Japaridze Tarot, so that's what I'm going with. This deck was out of print for a little while, but came back fairly recently, and I'm really glad that it did, because it's really, really beautiful, and it was a deck that I've been sort of curious about for a long time. This war card replacing the Emperor is one that people have very strong feelings about. I actually think it's quite interesting and very powerful. But anyway, that's a conversation for another day. This is another one of those decks that's very artsy. Different style of art, obviously, to the Fountain Tarot, but artsy nonetheless. And it's just stunning. The colours in here are beautiful. And just really, really interesting takes on the cards again. Let me skip to some minor arcana. This moon card though, the eyeball, it's kind of creepy, a bit unsettling, but really beautiful. And let's take a look at some of the minor arcana, because I clearly haven't even shuffled it yet. I love how, even though these cards, some of them sort of look collagey, others are more like watercolor, the color palette itself really ties this whole deck together. So it never feels, at least to me, just looking through the cards, it doesn't ever feel disjointed. Like there's a few different styles going on, even if it is the same artist. I think the color palette really ties it all together. Now zooming in for another tiny deck, this is the Mesquite Tarot. This is a deck that I've actually owned twice. This is the second of this deck that I've had. Clearly this one isn't shuffled. This was a deck that I absolutely fell in love with, the imagery. I just adore it. I think it's so beautiful. It is very small, which I quite like, especially when the artwork is, you know, it doesn't need a lot of space for artwork like this because it is quite simplistic. I've spoken before how I've had sort of a weird relationship with this deck. I love this imagery. And when I see cards, I think I love how they've been depicted. I think they're really striking, simple but effective. That sort of approach I really enjoy. But then when I got it, I don't know what it was, but I just sort of didn't click with this deck. I didn't really enjoy doing readings with it. It just didn't do a lot for me. So I got rid of it, but then I missed it and got it again, and haven't really worked with it since. I sort of have slowed down how much I work with tarot. So it's a deck that I definitely want to give like another go, because I love it. I love this artwork. I think it's really, I've already said it, simple but so effective. And I think sometimes that more simplistic approach, like it takes a lot of consideration of what's important, what's necessary to the card and its meaning. And I really appreciate that. I like it a lot. And also I just really like this color palette. I think it's really pretty. So I'm not sure. I don't have a lot to say about this deck at the moment, but it is one, again, that I want to work with. Oh, that's the other thing. I really like the court cards and the names that they've renamed the court cards. So we have the novice, the student, the knower, and the leader. And I think I love those. I know plenty of decks these days rename the court cards, but I think this is possibly my favorite that I've seen in terms of the renaming. Then this one here is my Centennial Rider-Waite-Smith edition. I do have the large green box, but it's sort of up holding some books steady on my bookshelf. And we've all seen the Rider-Waite-Smith. The Centennial has this really nice backing and just really nice cardstock. It's a great deck. Yeah. You've seen this one before. I don't need to show it to you more. The only other true Rider-Waite-Smith I own currently is this UK purple box. I have done a whole video talking about like the differences between different editions and stuff. And this has long been my favorite. This is actually like not a super expensive edition. It was published in the 90s. It does have a little copyright, but I think in terms of like the value and what you get, if you're interested in some of the older printings, I think this is a really good edition. It's not quite as nice as some of the really, like the blue box, for example, but it's pretty close. And for like much more affordable, I think it's a good option. And it means that I can still like use this deck without freaking out that I'm like destroying my investment, you know. And while we're talking about Rider-Waite-Smith, let's just quickly show the Universal Tarot, I think it's called. This is a clone of the Rider-Waite-Smith, and I've trimmed it. So this is sort of what is my little pocket deck. The backing's kind of, I don't really like the backing, but I do really like this is probably the card that's most different. The rest of the cards are almost exactly the same. They almost look like they've just been traced over and redrawn for the most part. Some mild variations, but I do think of this as a Rider-Waite-Smith clone. The colours are really pretty. It's the cards we know and love, just very slightly different. And trimming it makes it a great little pocket deck. Speaking of trimmed pocket decks, this is one of my all-time favourite decks, the Stellar Tarot, or Stella's Tarot. I've done a few videos on this deck actually before. This is one of my old favourites. I think it was one of my early unboxings or reviews or something as well on this channel, so I'll leave a link to that if I can find it in the description box below. The artwork in this is just really pretty. I absolutely love it. I have switched around the kings and the knights in this deck because it just made more sense to me, and seeing as I was trimming off the titles, I figured why not? The colours in this deck are really vibrant. They're really fun. They actually were like a normal, fairly normal sized deck, but the border is really large. And when you trim it off, it becomes this tiny, tiny little pocket deck, and the artwork's just so beautiful. This deck I think is still technically in print, although it's kind of hard to get a hold of outside of Japan from memory. But it remains one of my favourite decks, and one of the decks that I'm most fond of because I've had a lot of fun with this deck. I think this is one of those decks that made me sort of fall in love with reading tarot, sort of like helped me like click with a lot of the cards that I'd struggled with before. So yeah, I still love this deck, but it also is just a very sentimental, like special deck to me. I just adore it. And another deck that's an old favourite that I've had so much fun reading with over the years is the Sasuraibito Tarot. This deck is probably one of my most used decks. Even though I haven't had it for as long as some of my others. The minute I pulled this deck out of the box, it was one of those decks that I just didn't ever want to put down. I enjoyed the reading so much, but I still found them like really insightful and helpful as well. Everything just flowed so easily with this deck. It's so beautiful, and I just feel like the messages for me and like the imagery and how I read, it feels so easy. It's effortless working with this deck, but also a joy. I did a full review of this deck, and I think I remember describing this deck as like intimate. The artwork, it feels really intimate, and I stand by that. I love the sort of the positioning of the viewer to whoever is in the card. I think it's really sweet, and like the King of Cups, this old grandpa, it's such a beautiful deck, and to me, like, I don't know. Every time I pull it out and do one of these like videos where I'm talking about different decks, whenever I pull this deck out, I just want to keep it out and keep working with it because I just think it's absolutely fabulous. Another old favourite of mine is a Fantastic Menagerie by Bubba Studios. This is by no means a perfect deck. I mean, it does draw on artwork from a certain time in history. But as for like how it's been executed as a tarot deck, I really like it. This is the old edition. I don't have the new one, and I'm more than happy with my old one. This is another one of those decks that I just had so much fun reading with, and that really sort of got me out of my comfort zone, but helped me become a much more confident reader. I did a whole video about sort of learning to read without guidebooks, and this was sort of the deck that helped me personally. I'm a perfectionist, and I'm not always someone who has a lot of confidence in new things, or I'm more somebody who feels like I have to be perfect before I can like start doing something, which is ridiculous. Anyway, this deck, I got this deck in a trade, which was really incredible because this was a very expensive, hard to find deck at the time. And I couldn't get the guidebook. And at the time I was still fairly new to tarot, and I sort of thought that meant that I couldn't use this deck because it's quite different. It's not your standard Rider-Waite-Smith clone. But then one day I sort of pulled it out and gave it a whirl, and turns out I could read the cards. Who'd have thought? And I had a really good time with it. I think the sort of satire, the dark humor in this deck just really appeals to me personally. Some of these cards are really fucked up, if I'm perfectly honest, but I think they really work with the tarot system. I think they've all been assigned to the cards really thoughtfully and effectively. Turns out I'm just pulling out all of my old favorites at the moment. This is the World Spirit Tarot by Lauren O'Leary. And this is the original like Llewellyn edition. I know that it has since been republished independently. I don't know if that's still available directly from the creator. But this is such a fun deck, such a cool deck. And I think it stands the test of time for the most part, this deck. I'm not sure when it was published, but it's by no means a new deck at all. And it really aimed to represent the diversity of human experience. And I think it did it before its time as far as the tarot community and the sort of expectations of publishers and things like that, which I think is really cool. It's one of the few decks that depicts a lot of different body types, different ages, and it's not new. So I think this deck is pretty cool in that respect. It's also just a really good deck to read with. It is based on Rider-Waite-Smith, so the cards are pretty, you know, if you know the system, you know this deck. But there are some changes, and I think most of them are really effective. The different editions are slightly different. A couple of the cards have been changed. So that's a personal preference as to which one you like. I definitely wanted this one personally. And it's not one of those decks that you, at least when I got this, that you really had to spend a huge amount to get, even if it is out of print. I found it fairly affordably, I think, on eBay. And I'm glad I did, because I've had some really wonderful readings with this deck and I've just really enjoyed having it in my collection. It's a deck that I've really appreciated and has grown to mean quite a lot to me, if I'm honest. I really like it. Now a deck I am sure to get hate for putting in the tarot collection instead of oracle deck collection video. It's the Guardian Angel Tarot cards. And I get it. It's Doreen Virtue. She's changed basically every name, every suit, everything to take the bite out of tarot. But I do think other decks have changed tarot too, and yet the community sort of accepts them as tarot. And I'm not saying this is the greatest tarot deck of all time, but I see the tarot system here. And I've spoken about this deck before, how I have a soft spot for this deck because for some reason it reminds me of my Catholic Nana. There's something kind of Catholic-y about this deck for some reason, and I don't really know what to point to specifically. I don't know if it's the weird angels or if it's the frilly lacy bits or what. But it just sort of, it gives off that vibe. And so for me personally, I find this deck quite comforting and soothing. It reminds me of who was my favourite person in the world, my Nana. So, that's this deck. You either love it or you hate it. I kind of love it. Now this Spacious Tarot by Carrie Mallon and Annie. I've forgotten Annie's surname. But this deck is so cool. This is one of the last decks I got before I sort of took my break and stopped using tarot so much. So I haven't used it as much as I would like to, but I have done readings with it and I've really enjoyed those readings. This is one of those decks that I feel like really gets to the essence of the card and chooses to reinterpret that traditional imagery in a new way, in a very clever way and in very effective ways. The artwork, Annie's artwork, is absolutely beautiful. This deck is just gorgeous. Carrie's guidebook it's just a little white book, but it's, again, very thoughtful and very well executed. Everything's here and it's just so well done. I think, did I do a review or an unboxing? I can't remember, but I spoke about how this deck, I feel like the Spacious Tarot is the perfect name because each card gives you enough to sort of, connect you to the traditional meaning and the meaning that Carrie has sort of presented. But it doesn't over deliver for you. So there's space for you in here. There's space for you to sort of interpret the cards as is appropriate for you and as sort of works for your understanding of the cards. I also think the choice to not include humans, again, I sort of feel like it's allowing us to step into the card. I don't know, I think it's really beautifully done to make the card and our experience of the card a personal one, if that makes sense. I don't know. I haven't used this deck really this year at all, because I've been over, haven't been using tarot so much. But now that I'm sort of like trying to use tarot a little bit more intentionally, this is a deck that I think I would like to return to sometime soon, because the time that I did spend with it was really worthwhile, really enjoyable. And yeah, I think this is a great deck. Now, the Dark Days Tarot by Ren McMurdo. This is a black and white deck, a square deck, and it's an interesting deck that I sort of didn't know that I was super interested in until I saw it in person. I think it's much more beautiful in person than in the internet sort of allows these images. I don't know, just something happens, I swear, with cameras sometimes. This artwork is so beautiful. And this is one of those decks that I have had really weird experiences with. Like the kind of experiences that don't always make sense in terms of like my understanding of the world. I don't know. But I just sort of try to allow those experiences to exist without, pushing them away. The major arcana are the white backgrounds with the like black and grey drawings. The minor arcana are reversed. So we have the black backgrounds. So it's cool because you can really see that when you lay them out. I originally sort of didn't think about getting this deck partly because of that though. I was worried that I'd have trouble sort of making out the details in the cards, but I didn't end up having that trouble. I love the sort of like, it's a really magical, fantastical, almost dreamlike depiction of the tarot. Like it's almost like surrealist. It's really well done. It's really beautiful. And I've just had some of the best readings I've ever had with this deck. I love all like the eyes, the moons. Like there's a lot of like recurring motifs in this deck, which I think make it really effective and just like, it's like a world you can sink into. I don't know, it's just beautiful. A lot of mermaids too. And just really strong, powerful imagery. And each card almost feels like its own miniature world. I really love this deck. Now back to an old favorite. This is the Liminal Tarot by Penelope Klein. This was the first like big investment deck I made. I bought this directly from the creator when this deck was still in print. It's a limit of only 200 copies, I think. And it was like, including shipping and exchange rate and everything, it was the most expensive deck I'd ever bought. And I think it still is, to be honest. And I never regretted it. I just think it's such beautiful artwork. I love that this artwork is essentially inspired by Lady Frida Harris's artwork in the Thoth Tarot, but it is more of a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which I love because I've always really liked the artwork in the Thoth Tarot, but I don't like the Thoth Tarot. And these colors, it's just so pretty. And yeah, I've spoken about this deck a lot over the years, so I don't know that there's a lot more for me to say about it. Isn't this Hierophant stunning? Like, look at it. It's just absolutely beautiful, this deck. A Queen of Swords on her throne of books. I love in particular how like water and the sky, in terms of the artwork, it's just those things especially are just really, really beautiful in this deck. And here's our like extra card, Anima Mundi. And I love these fairies. So there's an element of the fantastical in this deck. And I think the Six of Swords is one of my favorite depictions of that card ever in this deck. And I love these lines and the sense of movement and momentum and like the airiness of this deck. I don't know. It's really, really beautiful. I personally think it's one of the most beautiful decks I own. I just really like it. I just wanted to show you a few of my favorite cards from this deck because I just think they're beautiful. This is the Four of Swords. I just love it. Such like soft fantasy vibes. The Six of Swords, absolutely beautiful. The Four of Cups. Apparently I love the fours and the sixes. Four of Discs. And the Six of Discs. I just love this. Yeah, they're some of my favorite depictions of those cards ever. Now for the Sakki Tarot. What a deck. I got this one sort of towards the end of when I was going to be taking a break as well. So I haven't used this one a lot, but I have done some readings with it and I had a lot of fun with those readings. This is a deck that I was sort of curious about and I'd sort of seen here and there. I didn't know a lot about though. I'd always liked the imagery, and then it came up for sale, and so I grabbed it, and I'm really glad I did. I don't really know a lot about the deck. It didn't come with like a book or anything, or even a box. But I just think like the colors are really fun. Even just the shape of the cards and the borders, and I don't know. It's pretty Rider-Waite Smith, but just in super fun, colorful artwork. And I don't know. I'm here for that sometimes. I'm here for that. It's kind of weird how a lot of the people, not all of the people, but a lot of them just like don't have heads, which is an interesting choice. And then our like little animals, they're just really weird. I feel like wacky. Wacky is a good word for this deck. It feels almost like, I don't know, reminds me of cartoons and stuff and some of the books I read in the 90s. It's got that sort of vibe, which I like. Another old favourite of mine that I've done a review on is the Circo Tarot. This deck is just wonderful. It's quite quirky in its artwork. I just love these colours. I'm not really sure which edition I have. I got a bit confused, but I did back this on Kickstarter however many years ago. And I just think it's a really beautiful deck. If you'd like to hear me more, like talk more about my experiences with the cards, what I like about the deck, what I don't like about the deck, I'll leave a link to the full review that I did, which I definitely suggest checking out if you're interested. But I think you can tell why I like this deck. The colors are just incredible. It's such a vibrant, playful, alive sort of deck. I think it really has quite a lot of personality. And some of these images are just, I don't know, really cool. I like them a lot. Definitely got the circus vibe going on, which makes sense for the name, but it doesn't feel like a novelty deck in any way. I think it definitely stands on its own 2 feet. It's just really, it feels like its own little world, and I really like decks that can sort of do that. Next up we have the Idiosyncradeck Tarot by Jessica Bott. This deck was very, very, very kindly gifted to me by Tracy Timmerman, which I'm still not quite over. This is one of those decks that I just sort of fell in love with. I mean, I knew I liked it online and I was curious about it, but I was not surprised. I was not expecting, how much I would like fall head over heels in love with it when I got it in my hands. I responded to this in like a really emotional way, which I was not expecting at all. And I still don't really know quite how to explain. But I just think this is a wonderful deck. Again, one of those really sort of like simplistic but effective approaches to the cards, which clearly I quite like. And yeah, I don't know if it was the teacups or what was going on, but something got me. Something got me right in the feels when I started working with this deck. And it's still a very, very special one to me, not only because it was a gift, but also because of, I don't know, I just feel like I connect to this deck in some way that I don't always have words for. And that feeling is a really special one that I cherish and appreciate a lot. Next up is another old favourite of mine, the Minute Tarot by Robin Tish Hollister. I've done heaps of videos on this deck, so you've seen this one on my channel before. This is a Rider-Waite Smith clone, essentially, but Robin gave themselves, I can't remember, was it 3 or 5 minutes or something ridiculous, a time limit basically, in which to complete each card. They were essentially in the middle of another tarot project and were sort of having a bit of a artist block experience. And so they created this project to sort of get themselves out of that funk. And what resulted is one of my favorite decks of all time. Like the urgency and the immediacy of the creation of the cards, I think really comes across in the cards themselves and how I experience and read them. Whenever I do a reading with this deck, even if it's a larger reading, it just feels really snappy. And I love that. I love the idea of sort of having such a short time frame in which to essentially decide what's essential in the card. Like what is important for you to depict the card so that people know what it is and, you know, they can read with it. I think there's a really fun, playful, experimental sort of approach to the cards. And I think it has resulted in a really great little deck. And it's one of my favorites. I love the colors, I love the art. Sometimes it's kind of a bit odd and off, but it works. And it's one of my favorite decks to read with. I really love it. Now for our Monstarot or Little Monsters Tarot by Joanna Nelson. This is another deck I've spoken about a lot on this channel. I did what I think would be one of my favorite reviews I've ever done. So I'll leave a link to that if you're interested. This deck I just think is such a beautiful one. Again, colors. I'm really drawn to certain colors, clearly. and it's here in spades. These cutesy little creatures, I was sort of not 100% sold on this deck when I saw it online, I have to be honest, because I was worried that it'd be a little bit too quirky and cutesy. But when I read with this deck, I feel like these little monsters almost offer like an objective point of view. I don't know. I spoke about it in that review. I'll leave a link to it below if you want to hear me talk about that a little bit more thoughtfully than I can right now after talking about however many decks in a row. Point is, I just adore this deck. I think it's actually got a layer of, or a level of, I don't know, like thoughtfulness to this artwork that maybe isn't obvious. Like maybe the cutesiness sort of distracts from just how I think clever this deck can be. And yeah, I don't know. I really, really love it. And it ultimately is one of those decks that it makes me smile, it makes me happy. And we need more of that in this world, I think. So yeah, it's a special one. The This Might Hurt Tarot deck by Isabella Rotman. This one has gotten quite a lot of hype on TarotTube in the couple of years since it was released. And that is because it's absolutely stunning and just a really beautiful deck. I haven't spent so much time with this deck. I've done a couple of readings and I can't say that I've like fallen head over heels in love with it yet. I also haven't dedicated enough time, I don't think, to really make a call on that either way. I really like this artwork and I think sort of the depictions of people here are really thoughtful too. I like how this sort of, it is fairly modern, you know, like we have modern dress and whatnot. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a lot to say about this other than that I really like the look of it because I haven't spent a lot of time with it. But it is one that I would like to spend more time with. I like this, how we've got them wearing masks there. It's a really beautiful deck. I don't have a huge amount to say about it at this stage, but hopefully I'll have more to say in the future, I suppose. Such a cute little card. Next up we have Our Tarot by Sarah Shipman. This is such a cool deck and one of the best like productions I've seen for mass market decks, and I think possibly my favorite guidebook that I have received with the deck too. This deck is essentially all different women, notable women throughout history, and the artwork's really beautiful. The cards are actually quite small, which I was surprised by because the large box that it comes in is massive. This is just a little inside box for the cards. The artwork's really, really beautiful. And it has such an interesting like variety of women that have been selected. And the guidebook, I'm still not over the guidebook. It is a chunky beast. It's full color. And each card has like several pages dedicated to discussing like a little mini bio of the woman, but then also explaining like why they've been chosen to represent the card that they have. And that I feel like is quite important. Additionally, I will say my friend Corvin Green has been doing a video on each card, sort of exploring more about the history of the woman and the representation and stuff. And I haven't watched all of them. I watched the first few and I want to get back to the series. But if you like this deck and you sort of want to get into the cards a bit more and understanding the history and like the relevance of the symbolism and whatnot, I definitely recommend that, and I will leave it a link in the description box below for you. Because yeah, this is a deck that I feel like even if you're not interested in tarot, if you're a feminist and you are interested in women and their stories, like because of that guidebook and how thorough it is, I think this deck offers a lot. And it's a deck that you could really spend a huge amount of time with. I've spent a bit of time with it and I've had some great readings with it, but I still feel like I haven't even scratched the surface. There's so much here and I think it's been really well done and I'm excited to explore it a little bit more. Next up we have the Tarot Mucha, which is surprisingly one of my favorite decks. I wasn't expecting it to be when I picked it up. I think I picked it up, did I pick it up secondhand or did I get it from the shop that I work at? I don't remember. Either way, it wasn't one that I was really on my radar. I think I was just saw it and it was a bit of an impulse buy. But I've just really enjoyed working with this deck. I think it's really beautiful. It can be a bit tricky to sort of learn originally because we don't have any like titles or anything on the cards, which for the most part is fine. This is the Four of Cups. But if you're not super familiar with it or even just because some of the imagery is slightly different. Like the court cards can, might stump you up a little bit, but once you sort of get used to it, for example, this is the Knight of Pentacles. So it's got like a little representation of a horse for the knight. But it is pretty well a Rider-Waite-Smith base deck, and I've got that in the middle. Does anybody else ever do that? And I really like it. I think it's so pretty, and I've just had some great readings with it. It's a sort of deck that you can just sort of pull out, and I don't know, I just feel like it's one of those like old, faithful, reliable sort of decks that I have that I don't always think to rave about, but whenever I use, I really enjoy. And then I do technically have one more tarot deck, but it's been sitting in the parcel post on my shelf for 18 months now. This is the Children of Litha. I ordered it back in January 2020, I think. And I don't know why, but I haven't gotten around to opening it. So this is why I haven't really bought any new decks since, because if I still haven't even opened this, I shouldn't be buying new decks. Eventually, I was really excited about this deck, so I don't know why I've taken so long to get to it. I think partly because of our move and everything. But anyway, I just wanted to include this for to be thorough. I do have another tarot deck. Can't show you though because it's still sealed up. Alright, that is every single tarot deck that is currently in my collection. Thank you so much for watching, and I'd also like to say a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon for your support, and especially big thank you goes to Laurie, Lynette Brown and Livia. But this video has already been so long, so I will keep this outro short and sweet. Thank you again for watching. I will see you again in the next video. So much love. Bye.